He knelt beside a little girl in a wheelchair, a stranger's child, and did what no specialist, no therapist, and no amount of money had managed to do in 3 years. He simply asked her what she loved. What happened next stopped everyone in that park cold. The girl's mother, one of the most powerful women in the country, was watching from a distance, hidden behind her security detail, and she could not look away. By the time she finally approached him, her hands were shaking. Because what she had just witnessed wasn't medicine, it wasn't therapy, it was something she had forgotten existed. If stories like this one move something in you, the kind of stories that remind you what actually matters in this life, then this channel is exactly where you belong. Hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss what we share next. Give this video a like if you're already feeling it, and drop a comment telling me the city and country you're watching from. I genuinely want to know how far this story has traveled. Now settle in, this one is going to stay with you. The alarm went off at 5:47 a.m., 13 minutes before it was supposed to, because the clock on Ronan Mercer's nightstand had been running fast for 2 months, and he'd never gotten around to fixing it. He lay there for a few seconds with his eyes open, staring at a water stain on the ceiling that looked vaguely like a boot, and then he swung his legs over the side of the bed and sat up. His back ached. It always ached on Saturday mornings. Friday nights at the Kellerman Distribution Center were the worst shift of the week. The trucks came in late, the inventory counts were always off, and the dock supervisor, a heavy-set man named Pruitt, had a habit of disappearing for long stretches and then reappearing just in time to take credit when things went smoothly. Ronan had been there for 14 months. He had learned to stay invisible, do the work, and go home. He pulled on a gray t-shirt and a pair of worn jeans and padded down the hallway to Tessa's room. She was already awake. She was lying on her stomach across her bed, her feet kicked up behind her, coloring in a workbook she'd gotten from the school library. The crayons were everywhere. On the bed, on the floor, one of them wedged under her pillow for reasons Ronan had long since stopped trying to understand. "You're up early," he said. "I had a dream about butterflies," Tessa said, without looking up. There were like 1,000,000 of them, and they were all different colors. Were they friendly butterflies? Dad. She finally looked at him with that expression she'd been perfecting since she was about 5. The one that said she was 7 years old and fully aware that he was not as funny as he seemed to think he was. "Butterflies don't have personalities." "Some do," Ronan said. "I've met a few." She went back to her coloring. "Can we go to the river park today?" "Riverside?" "The one with the fountain that doesn't work anymore." "That's Riverside," he said. "Yeah, we can go." She made a small, satisfied sound and selected a new crayon. Ronan went to the kitchen and made coffee. Strong, black, no sugar. He stood at the counter and drank half of it before he remembered to eat anything, and then he found a granola bar in the back of a cabinet and ate that standing up, looking out the window at the narrow alley behind their building. It was October. The trees at the far end of the alley had gone mostly gold and orange, and the morning light was coming in low and flat, the way it did in fall. He thought briefly about nothing, which was its own kind of discipline. Riverside Park was about a 20-minute walk from their apartment on Calverton Street, and Tessa talked almost the entire way. She told him about a boy at school named Marcus, who had declared himself the king of the monkey bars and was making everyone else ask permission to use them, and she told him about a book she'd read about dolphins that had made her cry a little, but in a good way, and she told him that she'd decided she wanted to learn to make soup. "Real soup," she clarified, "not from a can." "What kind of soup?" "I don't know yet. I'm still thinking about it." "That's a responsible approach." "I know," she said. He was carrying a canvas bag with 2 water bottles, a container of grapes, and a jacket for Tessa in case it got cold. The jacket was too small. He'd noticed it the last time she wore it, back in September, and he made a mental note to get her a new one before the real cold came in. He made a lot of mental notes like that. Some of them he remembered to act on. Others drifted away somewhere between the end of his shift and the beginning of the next one. Riverside Park was not a particularly impressive park. The fountain in the center hadn't worked in at least 3 years, and the benches along the main path had that weathered, slightly gray look that came from not being repainted often enough. But there were big old trees that made good shade in summer and good color in fall, and there was a broad paved area near the east fence where kids liked to ride bikes and run around, and Tessa loved it in the uncomplicated way that children love places that have simply been good to them. They found a bench near the iron fence that ran along the park's east edge, and Ronan set down the canvas bag and stretched his shoulders while Tessa immediately began investigating the area around the bench for anything interesting. Acorns, interesting rocks, evidence of squirrel activity. That was when he saw the girl. She was sitting in a wheelchair about 15 feet away, close to the fence, positioned so that she was facing the open paved area where other children were moving around. She looked to be about 6, maybe a little younger. She had dark hair pulled back loosely, and she was wearing a light blue jacket, and she was watching the other children the way you watch something through glass, present but separated, quietly aware of the distance. There was no adult immediately beside her. There were 2 men in dark clothing standing maybe 20 feet away near the fence, one of them with an earpiece, and they were clearly doing that thing where you pretend to be casual while actually watching everything. Security, Ronan recognized. The expensive kind, not the mall cop kind. These men had a particular posture, weight distributed, sightlines organized, attention split and managed. He glanced around more carefully. A woman was standing near the tree line about 40 feet away, half turned, speaking quietly into a phone. She was well dressed in that way that didn't announce itself loudly. Dark coat, careful posture, the kind of stillness that came from being used to managing a great deal. She was probably in her early 30s. She was not looking at the girl in the wheelchair, or she was pretending not to. Tessa came around from behind the bench and stopped when she saw the other girl. For a moment, Tessa just looked at her. Then she walked over. Ronan watched without moving. "Hi," Tessa said. "I'm Tessa." The girl in the wheelchair looked up. Her eyes were dark and careful. "I'm Sienna," she said. "Do you want to play? We're not playing anything yet, but we could think of something." Sienna's expression shifted. Something moved through it. Something that was almost a smile and then wasn't quite. "I can't," she said. Her voice was quiet, not sad exactly, but careful. Like she'd said that sentence enough times that it had become its own kind of armor. Tessa frowned, not unkindly. "How come?" Sienna didn't answer. She looked down at the armrests of the wheelchair. Ronan got up from the bench. He walked over slowly, the way you approach something you don't want to spook, and crouched down so that he was at eye level with the girl. Sienna looked at him with a kind of measured wariness. She was used to adults asking about her. He could see that. Used to being the subject of concerned expressions and careful questions, and that particular tone people used when they were talking to someone they'd already decided needed to be handled gently. He didn't use that tone. "What's your name?" he asked, which she'd already told Tessa, but he asked it anyway because it gave her something to answer that wasn't about what was wrong with her. "Sienna," she said. "I'm Ronan. That's my daughter Tessa, who apparently doesn't believe in warm-up conversations." He glanced at Tessa. Tessa shrugged without apology. "That's okay," Sienna said, and this time the almost smile made it a little further. "What do you love doing?" Ronan asked. It wasn't what she was expecting. Her eyes came up to meet his, and he could see her recalibrating, shifting from whatever prepared answer she had for the standard questions to something that was actually hers. "Drawing," she said. "I really like drawing." Ronan reached into the pocket of his jeans. He always had chalk in there on Saturdays. Tessa had a thing for drawing on sidewalks, and he'd gotten into the habit of carrying a piece or two. He pulled out a thick piece of white chalk, looked at it for a second, then looked at the paved ground in front of Sienna's wheelchair. He drew a circle. Big, sweeping, imperfect. The kind of circle only a person who isn't worried about making it perfect actually draws. "There," he said. He handed the chalk to Sienna. She looked at it. Then she looked at the circle. Then she looked at him. "What's it for?" she asked. "Whatever you want it to be." Tessa, who had watched this exchange with interest, immediately dropped to her knees and produced a second piece of chalk from her own jacket pocket, because she was her father's daughter, and began drawing inside the circle without any further ceremony. "This is the castle," she announced. "This part here is the main hall, and this is the dragon's room, but the dragon is friendly. She just looks scary." Sienna stared at her. "What should this part be?" Tessa asked, pointing to a section of the circle near Sienna's wheelchair. "The garden," Sienna said after a moment. "Okay, draw it." Sienna leaned forward from the wheelchair, extending the chalk toward the pavement. It was a small motion, carefully managed, and Ronan watched her face while she made it, watched the concentration, the slight tension in her jaw. She drew a rough cluster of shapes that were meant to be flowers. They weren't particularly accurate flowers. They were the flowers of a child who hadn't been given enough chances to just draw. "Those are really good," Tessa said, completely sincerely. Something loosened in Sienna's face. They worked on the kingdom together, Tessa providing the running commentary and the general narrative framework, Sienna contributing details with a precision and intentionality that surprised Ronan. She had opinions about where things should go. She drew a fountain in the garden, and a small cat near the fountain, and a tower that was taller than Tessa's tower, which Tessa accepted with complete equanimity because, she explained, different towers had different purposes. Ronan sat on the pavement with his back against the fence and watched them. At some point, Sienna laughed. It came out of her unexpectedly. Tessa had said something about the friendly dragon's eating habits, and it was a short, genuine laugh, slightly surprised by itself, like a laugh that hadn't been used in a while and wasn't quite sure of its own sound. Ronan saw it and looked away, because he understood instinctively that some moments didn't survive being directly observed. He reached into the canvas bag and pulled out the container of grapes and set it on the ground between the girls. Neither of them acknowledged it immediately, but a few minutes later Tessa took a handful and offered some to Sienna, and Sienna took them, and they kept drawing. It happened without warning. Sienna had leaned forward to add detail to the cat near the fountain. She was particular about the cat, which had already been revised twice, and her left foot, which had been resting against the footrest of the wheelchair, slipped off and touched the ground. She went still. Not a frightened stillness, a listening stillness. Ronan saw it happen. He saw her foot make contact with the pavement, and he saw her face change, not with pain, but with something more complicated than that. Recognition. The kind of recognition that happens in a body before the brain has fully processed what it means. She stayed very still. Her fingers were still wrapped around the chalk, but she wasn't drawing. She was somewhere inside herself, attending to something. "I felt it," she said. The words were barely above a whisper. She wasn't talking to anyone in particular. Ronan kept his voice level. This was the part that mattered. Not just what had happened, but what happened in the next 30 seconds. He had seen situations go wrong when people responded to unexpected good news with the same panic they used for unexpected bad news. The body picked up the energy around it, especially a child's body. "I saw it," he said quietly. She looked at him. "Don't move too fast," he said. "Just notice." She looked down at her foot. Then she looked back up at him. Her eyes were wide, but not afraid. "I could feel the ground," she said. "Yeah?" "Like, actually feel it, not just pressure. I could feel the texture." "Okay," Ronan said. He kept his expression steady and calm, not because he wasn't affected by what he'd just witnessed, but because he knew what it looked like when someone was holding on to calm for the sake of someone smaller. He'd been on the other side of that enough times to know what it cost and why it mattered. Tessa had stopped drawing and was looking at Sienna with open interest, not alarm. "Cool," Tessa said. Sienna made a sound that was almost a laugh. Then the atmosphere around them changed. One of the men in dark clothing near the fence had turned and was moving toward them with a specific kind of urgency. Controlled, direct, focused. The other was speaking into the earpiece. And from the tree line across the paved area, the woman in the dark coat had stopped her phone call and was already walking, her pace quick and deliberate, her eyes fixed on Sienna Sheb. Elara Voss moved through the park with the efficient, purposeful stride of someone who ran 11-hour board meetings without checking the clock, but her hands were in tight fists inside her coat pockets, and she was covering the distance between herself and her daughter faster than she probably realized. Sienna heard her coming and looked up. "Mom?" Elara reached the edge of the chalk circle and stopped. She took in the drawings on the pavement, the castle, the tower, the garden, the fountain, the cat. She took in the container of grapes on the ground. She took in Tessa, sitting cross-legged with chalk dust on her knees. And she took in the man with his back against the fence, who had stood up when she arrived, and was now watching her with a quiet, unhurried expression that she found, for some reason she couldn't immediately identify, unsettling. "Are you all right?" she asked Sienna. "I felt my foot," Sienna said. "The left one. On the ground." Elara looked at her for a long moment. Then she looked at the man. Her first security detail, Hargrove, had materialized at her shoulder. She was aware of him the way she was always aware of her security: present, managed, useful. But she wasn't looking at him. "Who are you?" she asked the man. He met her eyes. He had the look of someone who didn't feel the need to prove anything by how he stood or how much space he took up. Tired, she noticed. He had shadows under his eyes and the slightly worn quality of someone who stayed on their feet for longer than was good for them. His clothes were nothing. His hands were rough. "Ronan Mercer," he said, "my daughter and your daughter decided to build a kingdom." Elara looked at the chalk circle, then back at him. She felt sensation in her left foot. "I know, I saw. She hasn't had measurable sensation below the knee in over 2 years. I figured it was something like that." She stared at him. There was a quality to his stillness that she kept trying to categorize and couldn't quite. He wasn't intimidated by her, which a lot of people were, but it wasn't arrogance either. It wasn't the studied nonchalance of someone trying to demonstrate that they weren't impressed. He simply seemed to be exactly where he was, without performing anything about it. "What did you do?" she asked. "Nothing," he said. "They drew together." She laughed a couple of times. Her foot slipped off the footrest. "That can't be all." Ronan looked at Sienna, who was watching her mother with a complicated expression, love and a kind of careful distance that children sometimes develop around parents who are managing too much to be fully present. "That was all," he said. Elara opened her mouth to say something else, and then Hargrove touched her elbow, a minimal professional gesture, and said something quietly near her ear. She closed her mouth. She looked at Ronan for another moment. Then she crouched down beside Sienna's wheelchair and took her daughter's hand and held it. And for a second, she was just a mother and not the CEO of Voss Technologies, and not the woman whose philanthropic portfolio ran to 9 figures. And there was something in her face that was very close to the edge of something she wasn't going to let happen in front of strangers. "We should go," she said to Sienna. Her voice was steady. "Dr. Kessler needs to know about this today." Sienna nodded. Then she looked at Tessa. "Can I have the chalk?" Tessa considered for 1 second, which was about how long she ever took to make decisions. "Yeah," she said, "but you have to finish the cat later." "Okay," Sienna said. Tessa put the chalk in Sienna's hand, and Sienna closed her fingers around it. Elara stood back up. She looked at Ronan one more time. Whatever she was thinking, she kept it inside the coat with her fists. "Thank you," she said. "They played together," Ronan said. "That's what kids do." Elara held his gaze for exactly the time it took her to understand that he meant it, that this wasn't modesty or performance, that he genuinely didn't think he'd done anything. Then she nodded once, the way people nod when they're storing something to come back to, and guided the wheelchair toward the park exit. Tessa watched them go. Then she looked at the chalk circle, and the kingdom still spread across the pavement. "Is she going to be okay?" she asked. "I think so," Ronan said. "She was really good at the cat," Tessa said. "She was," Ronan said. He picked up the canvas bag and held out his hand, and Tessa took it, and they stood there for a moment at the edge of the chalk circle, this imperfect thing drawn on ordinary pavement, before the morning pulled them forward and the kingdom stayed behind. Elara Voss did not go directly home. She sat in the back of the black SUV with Sienna beside her and stared through the tinted window at the city moving past, and she did not speak for the first 4 blocks. Hargrove was in the passenger seat, quiet the way he was trained to be. The driver, a man named Clifton who had worked for her for 6 years, knew better than to fill silence she hadn't invited. Sienna was holding the piece of chalk. She had it in both hands, resting in her lap, and she kept turning it slowly the way children do with things they want to hold on to without drawing attention to the fact that they're holding on. "Does it still feel different?" Elara asked. Sienna considered the question. "Sort of, like it's warmer, the whole foot." "Warmer than usual or warm like—" "Just warm," Sienna said. "Not bad warm, just there." Elara nodded. She pulled out her phone and called Dr. Kessler's personal line, not the office number. He picked up on the 3rd ring, which meant he was at home, which meant she was interrupting his Saturday, and she was aware of that and didn't particularly care. "I need you to come in today," she said. Sienna had a sensory response in the left foot. Tactile. She described it as feeling texture, not just pressure. There was a pause on the other end. How long did it last? I don't know. I wasn't there when it started. That cost her something to say. She kept her voice flat. Maybe 2 or 3 minutes. I need the full workup. Nerve response, imaging, the new assessment you were waiting on. Today. Alara, the equipment, Kessler. Another pause. I'll be there in 90 minutes. She hung up. Sienna was watching her. Are they going to do the tests where I have to stay still for a long time? Probably, Alara said. Sienna accepted this without complaint, which was its own small heartbreak. She had been accepting things without complaint for a long time. That was one of the things Alara found hardest to sit with. The particular adaptability of her daughter, the way Sienna had learned to manage expectations before she even had them, the quiet competence of a 6-year-old who understood that some things were just part of her life now. Can Tessa come visit sometime? Sienna asked. We'll see. That usually means no. Alara looked at her. It means I don't know yet. Sienna looked back out the window. She kept turning the chalk. The test took 4 hours. Alara sat in a waiting room that cost more to furnish than most people's apartments, in the private medical annex on the 4th floor of the Voss Technologies building, and she drank bad coffee from a machine and answered emails on her phone and did not let herself think too specifically about what was happening down the hall. She had learned over the years that the space between hoping and knowing was where the worst damage happened, and she'd gotten reasonably skilled at not living there. At a little after 3 in the afternoon, Kessler came out. He was a trim man in his late 50s with the measured movements of someone who had delivered a great deal of news, good and bad, and had learned not to let his body telegraph the difference before his words did. Alara read him anyway. She'd been reading people her whole career and she was very good at it, and what she saw made her set the phone face down on the seat beside her. The imaging showed increased neural activity in the L4-L5 region, he said. It's not dramatic, but it's there, and it wasn't there in August. Meaning there's some degree of signal traveling that wasn't traveling 2 months ago. Now, he sat down across from her, which meant this was going to be a longer sentence than she wanted. This doesn't mean what you want it to mean yet. We don't know if it's consistent. We don't know if it's progressive. We don't know if it will translate into motor function or whether it stays in the sensory pathways. What I can tell you is that Sienna was not making it up, and she was not misinterpreting the sensation. Something real happened today. Alara was quiet for a moment. Something real happened today, she repeated. Yes. In a park, while a stranger's kid drew chalk castles with her. Kessler looked at her steadily. The body does things sometimes that we don't fully understand the trigger for. Relaxation, laughter, a reduction in the low-level cortisol load she carries from everything. Any of those things could theoretically lower the threshold enough for signals to get through that were being dampened before. So you're telling me that 3 years of specialized care and about $4 million in treatment costs, and what moved the needle was chalk on a sidewalk. I'm telling you that something moved, he said carefully. I'm not telling you what it was. Alara picked her phone back up. She didn't look at it. Keep monitoring. Weekly scans for the next month. I want a comparative report against everything from the past 18 months. I want to know if this holds. Of course. And Kessler. She finally looked at him. Don't mention the circumstances to anyone else on the team yet. I want the data first. He nodded and stood, and Alara sat alone in the expensive waiting room with the bad coffee going cold in her hand and tried to figure out what to do with the feeling she was having, which was something she hadn't felt in a very long time and didn't entirely trust. Ronan found out about the background check on Monday. He was in the break room at the distribution center, eating a sandwich he'd made the night before and reading something on his phone that wasn't interesting enough to hold his attention, when Darnell, one of the other floor workers, who'd been there twice as long as Ronan and knew things, sat down across from him with a look on his face. You know anybody fancy? Darnell asked. Ronan kept his eyes on his phone. Define fancy. Like corporate fancy. Like someone ran your plates and your employment, and I think your military records, which, how do they even do that? He paused. How do they do that? Ronan set the phone down. Who told you this? My cousin works IT security at Callaway Group. They subcontract background checks for a bunch of big firms. He said your name came through yesterday, flagged as a priority pull. Darnell looked at him with open curiosity. You do something? I met someone in the park on Saturday, Ronan said. Darnell waited. That's the whole story, Ronan said. That is not the whole story, Darnell said. Nobody runs a priority background check on a warehouse worker because they met him in a park. Who was it? Ronan thought about the woman in the dark coat. The way she'd looked at him with that particular kind of attention, not personal interest, not suspicion exactly, but the focused assessment of someone who made decisions about people for a living and was in the habit of gathering information before she made them. I'm not sure, he said, which was mostly true. Darnell looked at him for a long moment, then shook his head. You are a weird man, Ronan Mercer. Probably, Ronan said, and picked his phone back up. He thought about it on the drive home. I wasn't troubled by the background check exactly. There was nothing in his record that was going to tell anyone anything he was ashamed of, and the parts that were sealed, and that was the end of it. What he was turning over was why. Why not just send someone to talk to him? Why not just call? The background check first was the move of someone who wanted information before contact, someone who made sure the ground was solid before they put their weight on it. He pulled into the parking structure behind their building and sat in the car for a minute. Whatever she was looking for, she would either find it acceptable or she wouldn't. He didn't have a lot of energy to spend on variables he couldn't control. He had a second-grade parent-teacher conference to reschedule and a jacket to buy for Tessa, and a refrigerator that was making a sound it hadn't been making last week. He went upstairs. Alara read the report on Tuesday morning before her 7 a.m. calls. It was thorough. Her director of security operations, a former federal investigator named Marsh, had put together 4 pages on Ronan Mercer of 14B Calverton Street, and Alara read it the way she read everything, once, completely, without going back. 37 years old, born in Harlan, a mid-sized city about 4 hours inland, high school diploma, then naval enlistment at 18, advanced training, special operations designation, 8 years of active service, the last 3 in a Tier 1 unit that was referenced in the file in terms that were specific enough to convey what they meant and vague enough to keep it deniable. Honorable discharge, a commendation she wasn't going to find details on, and then nothing. A gap of about a year where he'd apparently moved 3 times, worked 2 jobs, and by all appearances been figuring out how to be a person who wasn't in the military anymore. His daughter, Tessa, was 7. Her mother had left when Tessa was 2. Not dramatically, the report noted, just a departure. A woman who had apparently decided that the version of the life she'd been living wasn't the version she wanted. There was no legal drama, no custody battle. Ronan had simply kept the child and raised her. There was a woman named Doris, in her mid-60s, in the same building, who watched Tessa during Ronan's night shifts, and had apparently been doing so since Tessa started school. Current employer, Kellerman Distribution Center, night dock team. Pay that Alara's assistant probably spent on lunch twice a week. No complaints on file, no incidents, a supervisor note that he was reliable and quiet and never left early. She turned to the last page. Marsh had added a personal note at the end, which he rarely did. It said, no indicators of interest beyond the file. No debt, no associations, no flag. He's exactly what he looks like. If anything, his background makes the circumstances of the park meeting more interesting, not less. Alara folded the report in half and set it on her desk. She picked up her phone and then put it down again. She sat there for a moment with the early light coming in through the floor-to-ceiling windows of her home office, 42 floors up, the city spread out below like something she owned, which in certain practical senses she partly did. Then she picked the phone back up and told her assistant to find a number for Ronan Mercer. I was in the middle of a shift when she called. He almost didn't pick up. He didn't recognize the number, and unknown calls during a shift were usually either robocalls or Pruitt calling from a different phone to tell him something that could have waited. But something made him step away from the dock and answer it. Ronan Mercer, he said. There was the briefest pause, the kind that happens when someone is adjusting to the fact that you answered differently than they expected. This is Alara Voss. We met in Riverside Park on Saturday. He leaned against the wall. I remember. I'd like to speak with you, not on the phone, in person. I have some things I want to discuss. What kind of things? Another small pause. She wasn't used to being asked that, he could tell. She was used to the meeting being agreed to and the what kind of things being revealed when she was ready to reveal them. My daughter's situation, she said, and a conversation I think we should have. I'm working until 6. Tomorrow morning, then. I can send a car. I have a car, he said. If you want to meet, I'll drive myself. This time the pause had a different quality to it. Fine. 9 a.m. I'll have my assistant send you the address. Okay. She hung up. Ronan stood at the dock wall for a moment with the phone in his hand, listening to the forklifts and the roll of the freight doors and the particular industrial noise of a Friday night shift, and then he went back to work. The Voss Technologies headquarters occupied a gleaming column of glass and steel in the city's financial district, and Ronan parked in the public structure 2 blocks away and walked, because he'd rather walk than deal with the valet situation. He was wearing the cleanest thing he owned that wasn't a work shirt, a dark blue button-down that Tessa had once told him made him look like he was trying, which he'd taken as a compliment. The lobby was the kind of lobby designed to make certain things clear before anyone said a word. The ceiling was high, the materials were expensive, and the 2 people at the reception desk had the polished efficiency of people paid well to be precisely that. Ronan gave his name and was handed a visitor badge and pointed toward a set of elevators. Alara's office was on the 39th floor. Her assistant, a young man named Penn, who had the organized calm of someone managing 16 things simultaneously, met him at the elevator and walked him down a corridor with that particular quiet that expensive carpeting creates, and then showed him into a corner office with 2 full walls of glass and a view that made everything outside the window look like a model of itself. Alara was standing, not sitting. She had a coffee in her hand and she was dressed with that same controlled precision, dark blouse, good slacks, heels that added 2 inches she didn't need. She looked at him when he came in, and he got the feeling she'd already been assessing the assessment, working out what she thought before she let herself respond to it. Thank you for coming, she said. Sure, Ronan said. She gestured to a chair. He sat. She sat across from him, not behind the desk. Across, at the low table near the windows, which was a choice. She set her coffee down and didn't offer him any, which he didn't mind. I had a report run on you, she said directly. I know, he said. That caught her. It was the first time her composure shifted, just slightly, just the small recalibration around the eyes. You know. Someone I work with has a contact in security services. He mentioned it Monday. She held his gaze for a moment. And you came anyway. You wanted to talk. I didn't do anything wrong. Background check doesn't bother me. What about the rest of your record, she said. The parts that weren't in the report. What about them? I know what a Tier 1 Special Operations designation means. I know what those units do. I'm asking if there's anything I need to understand about what you've done. And who you are now. Ronan leaned back slightly in the chair. He looked at her steadily, and she looked back, and neither of them made it a contest. It was just 2 people being honest about what kind of conversation they were having. I served, he said. I did my job. Some of what I did I'd do the same way again, and some of it I probably wouldn't, and most of it I don't talk about. I got out. I've been raising my daughter for 5 years on my own. I work nights, and I pay my bills, and I try not to be the kind of person my daughter is going to be embarrassed by when she's older. He paused. Is that what you needed to know? Not exactly, she said. But it's a start. She picked up her coffee again, more for something to do with her hands than because she wanted it, he thought. Sienna's imaging showed neural activity Saturday that wasn't present in her last scan in August. Ronan was quiet. Dr. Kessler doesn't want to overstate it. He's being careful. But something happened, and I want to understand what. She looked at him. I've had her in the best programs in the country. Private therapists, experimental treatments, specialists who charge more per hour than some people make in a month. And in 2.5 hours in a park, drawing with chalk, she felt sensation she hasn't felt in over 2 years. She stopped. I'm not accusing you of anything. I'm asking you what you saw. I saw 2 kids playing, Ronan said. That's what you keep saying. Because it's what happened. It's not enough of an explanation. Why does it need to be more? He wasn't being difficult. The question was genuine. Sienna's been treated like a patient for 3 years. Everything around her has been about her condition. Every adult in her life looks at her and sees what's wrong first. I didn't do that. He shrugged. That's not a medical treatment. I just talked to her like she was a kid. Alara looked at him for a long time. She asked about Tessa, she finally said. Tessa liked her, Ronan said. She was impressed by the cat. Something moved through Alara's face that wasn't quite a smile but was in that neighborhood. It lasted about half a second and then her expression reorganized itself. I want to make a proposal, she said, and I need you to understand that I'm not doing this out of sentiment. I've looked at what happened clinically, and I've looked at Sienna's pattern over the past 3 years. And one of the variables that keeps coming up is social environment. She's around adults almost exclusively. Her world has narrowed significantly. She's lonely, Ronan said. Alara's jaw tightened slightly, not with anger, with the particular resistance of someone who knows a thing is true and has been not thinking it. Yes, she said. She is. Okay. I'd like Sienna and Tessa to spend time together regularly. Structured, but not, she paused, not clinical, not supervised in a medical context. Just time, if you're willing. Ronan thought about it, not for long. I'd have to talk to Tessa. She'd have to want to. I'm not going to schedule her friendship. Of course. And it can't become something it isn't. I'm not a therapist. Tessa's not a treatment program. If they get along, they get along. If they don't, that's the end of it. Agreed. And Sienna needs to know that too, that Tessa's her friend, not her helper. Alara looked at him with an expression he couldn't fully classify. It was somewhere between respect and something more complicated. Maybe the particular discomfort of realizing someone had said something you should have thought of yourself. Yes, she said. You're right. They sat with that for a moment. You don't do this for anything, he said. The visit. You don't make it an exchange. I wasn't planning to. Your assistant will call me and say something about compensation, or... No, she said, sharply enough that it cut across what he was going to say. She looked like she wanted to say something else, something more defensive, and then thought better of it. No, she said again, quieter. It won't be like that. He nodded. Penn appeared silently in the doorway with the timing of someone who'd been listening for the shift in tone. Ms. Voss, you have the Harrington call in 6 minutes. Alara stood. Ronan stood. They were closer to eye level than he'd expected. She was taller than she'd seemed in the park. Or maybe the heels accounted for it. Saturday, she said. If the weather holds, there's a park closer to our building. More space. Better pavement. She said that last part with something almost wry in it. I'll ask Tessa, he said. He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair, and Penn walked him back to the elevator. In the lobby, he stopped and handed the visitor badge back to the woman at the desk, and she took it with a professional smile that meant nothing, and he walked back out into the city and thought about what he'd just agreed to. He didn't know, walking those 2 blocks back to his car, that Alara Voss had gone back to her window after he left and stood there long enough that Penn had to knock twice on the door to remind her about the Harrington call. He didn't know that she'd pulled his file back out and reread Marcia's note at the bottom. He didn't know that Sienna, when her mother came to her room that evening and told her she was going to see Tessa again on Saturday, had closed her eyes for a moment in a way that wasn't dramatic at all, just the private satisfaction of a child who had learned to keep her hoping small. He drove home in his ordinary car, through ordinary traffic, and picked Tessa up from Doris's apartment and made pasta for dinner, and asked Tessa while they were eating what she thought about seeing Sienna again. Tessa considered it with the seriousness it deserved. She still has my chalk, she said. She does, Ronan said. Then yeah, Tessa said. We should probably go get it. He nodded and put another serving of pasta on her plate, and the city outside their window went on doing what cities do, completely indifferent to what was taking shape inside it. Part 3 lưu ý, viết đủ 5 trên bằng 500 từ liên kết liền mạch với các phần trước trong câu chuyện pha hồi thoại tạo thành một câu chuyện liền mạch khi ghép lại. Mỗi phần liền mạch với phần trước, không giới thiệu lại câu chuyện ở đầu phần mới. Liên kết các phần của câu chuyện một cách liền mạch. Sử dụng câu chuyện tiếp giữa các phần. Duy trì chủ đề, tránh ngắt quãng đột ngột, không sử dụng gạch đầu dòng hoặc tiêu đề phụ, phong cách kể chuyện Mỹ, Hoa Kỳ, giống văn giàu cảm xúc. Kể theo ngôi thứ 3, giữ đồ kịch tính không viết lan man, nhân vật không hoàn hảo, hội thoại tự nhiên, tránh ngôn ngữ văn chương sáo rơi và cụm từ AI điển hình. Viết như nhà văn chuyên nghiệp, không như AI cố gắng nghe sàng. Có yếu tố con người, cầm miêu tả qua mượt mà và hoàn hảo,
Kết thúc phần không giới thiệu phần sau, câu chuyện không nhắc đến Chúa. Lưu ý trả lời trong mục tin nhắn không nhảy sang document, chỉ đơn bắt buộc, không được xuất hiện trong nội dung truyền. Đây là một câu chuyện điện ảnh hoàn toàn hư cấu được tạo ra chỉ nhằm mục đích giải trí, không đề cập hay ngụ ý rằng nó dựa trên sự kiện có thật, người thật hoặc câu chuyện có thật, không sử dụng các cụm từ như dựa trên một câu chuyện có thật, theo ghi chép, hoặc bất cứ điều gì tương tự. Tất cả các nhân vật, địa điểm, tổ chức và sự kiện phải hoàn toàn hư cấu, lưu ý đặc biệt quan trọng. Nếu đạt đến giới hạn trả lời, không được dùng giữa câu hay viết nốt câu đó hoàn chỉnh không mở rộng nội dung. Message collapsed, part 3. The second Saturday went better than the first, which wasn't something Ronan had been counting on. Alara had arranged access to a private terrace space attached to the Voss building. Not ostentatious exactly, but clearly not something anyone had to apply for a permit to use.
It was a broad, flat, paved area on the second floor with good light and a low wall around the perimeter, and enough room for 2 children to spread out without feeling contained. There were potted trees along one edge that had gone orange and red with the season, and the city noise filtered up from below in that ambient way that made it background rather than interruption. Ronan drove them there in his car, which Tessa had decorated years ago with a collection of small sticker animals along the dashboard, and which he'd never removed because she'd been so deliberate about their placement. Tessa spent most of the drive deciding which chalks to bring, which she was treating with the seriousness of someone packing for an expedition. She likes detail, Tessa said, holding up a thinner piece of chalk. So I'm bringing this one. The thick ones are good for the big shapes, but you can't do fur with them. You're planning on drawing fur? The cat needs whiskers, Tessa said. She knows that. We talked about it. Ronan glanced at her. When did you talk about it? Tessa gave him a look that said this was not a relevant question. She put the thin chalk in the bag. Sienna was already on the terrace when they arrived, sitting in her wheelchair near the center of the space with a small bag on her lap. She had the piece of chalk Tessa had given her the previous weekend in her hand. Alara was standing slightly behind and to one side, near the wall, with a tablet in one hand and the expression of someone who had told themselves they were just going to check in briefly and then get some work done. Tessa went straight across the terrace without preamble. I brought the thin ones, she said, showing Sienna the bag, for the whiskers. Sienna looked inside the bag with genuine interest. I've been thinking about the cat's tail, she said. I think it should curl. Yeah, curled tails are better, Tessa agreed, dropping to the pavement. Okay, so here, and that was the entirety of the reunion. Ronan stood near the door for a moment, watching them settle into the drawing like it had never been interrupted, and then walked over to where Alara was standing. She looked at him sideways. That was efficient. They know what they're there to do, he said. Alara glanced back at her tablet, then seemed to decide something and set it face down on the wall beside her. She slept better this week, she said. It wasn't entirely clear whether she was reporting this to him or just letting it exist out loud for the first time. Sienna? She's had trouble sleeping for a while, but Monday and Tuesday she went down without much trouble. Alara watched her daughter laugh at something Tessa had said. Kessler says the neural activity hasn't decreased since Saturday. It's holding. That's good. He still won't say more than that. Probably smart, Ronan said. Probably frustrating, she said, with the flat honesty of someone who wasn't trying to sound charming about it. He didn't argue the point. They stood there for a few minutes in a quiet that wasn't uncomfortable, which surprised him a little. Alara Voss did not look like a woman who was naturally comfortable with silence. She looked like a woman who managed it when necessary, which was different, but she wasn't filling it, and he appreciated that. She asked me about your daughter, Alara said finally, what her mother was like. Ronan looked at the girls. What did you say? I said I didn't know. She said Tessa told her that her mom left when she was really small, and that it was okay because she had her dad. She paused. She said it like it wasn't sad. Tessa did, I mean. It's just the truth, Ronan said. I don't treat it like a wound because it isn't one. Not for Tessa. And for you? He thought about that for a moment with the consideration it deserved. It was a long time ago. I don't carry it like I used to. Alara nodded. She seemed like she was going to say something else, and then didn't, and he let that be. Below them, the city went on. Above them, a thin November sky held its blue without committing to warmth. The girls drew for 2 hours. By the end, the cat had whiskers, a curled tail, 3 kittens that had not been in the original plan, but which both of them had decided were necessary, and a name, Marble, chosen by Sienna on the basis that the cat's coloring, as drawn, looked like a gray and white swirl. Sienna had been leaning over her left side for most of the last 40 minutes, working on the kittens, and when she finally sat back in the wheelchair, Ronan noticed her wince slightly and shift her weight. "Sore?" he asked, walking over her. "My side," she said, "from leaning." "You were down there a while." "The kittens took longer than I thought." Tessa studied the kittens critically. "They're really good, though." "The small one's better than the big one," Sienna said. "I need more practice with big shapes." "The big one's fine," Tessa said, in the tone of someone ending a conversation that didn't need to happen. Ronan crouched beside the wheelchair. "Can you feel that? The soreness in your side?" Sienna blinked at him. "Yeah, it's like when you stay in one position too long." "That's new?" He kept his voice the same, not excited, just curious. Sienna thought about it. "Kind of. I mean, I can always feel stuff above my waist, but this is lower, like closer to my hip." Ronan stood up. He looked across the terrace at Alara, who had been close enough to hear every word. She had both hands wrapped around the tablet, and her face had done that thing. The controlled, almost nothing expression of someone whose internal response was significantly larger than what they were showing. He held her gaze for a second. Then he looked back at Sienna. "You should tell Dr. Kessler that," he said. "I know," Sienna said, already sounding tired at the prospect. "He's going to want me to do the pokey test." "The what?" "It's this thing where he pokes you with a thing and asks you what it feels like." She made a face. "It doesn't hurt, it's just boring." "Better boring than not feeling it," Tessa said. Sienna considered this seriously. "True," she said. "What?" Kessler's report the following week added a notation about hip flexor region sensation that he described in writing as clinically significant but preliminary. In the margin of the printed copy, which Alara read in her car on the way to a board meeting, someone, she assumed Penn, had added the word preliminary, underlined twice, as a reminder, she supposed, not to let herself get ahead of the data. She appreciated the intention. She ignored it anyway. The thing about being a person who built a company from a 2-person startup to a publicly traded firm with 11,000 employees was that you learned to read signals before the full data was in. You learned that being early to a conclusion, when the conclusion was based on real pattern recognition and not wishful thinking, was often the difference between leading and following. She knew the difference. She'd made enough wrong calls to know when the evidence was solid. And the evidence, Kessler's measured, cautious, carefully hedged evidence, was pointing somewhere. The question she kept coming back to wasn't clinical. It was simpler and less comfortable. What was it about those hours with those 2 children that was doing what 3 years of the best medicine had not? She had a theory, but it bothered her, not because it was wrong, because if it was right, then she had spent 3 years solving the wrong problem. The 3rd Saturday, Ronan came alone. Tessa had woken up that morning with a low-grade fever and a complaint about her ear that Ronan recognized as the beginning of an ear infection. She'd had them before, always in the fall, always starting with this same combination of vague malaise and pressure. He'd called the pediatrician's after-hours line, gotten a prescription called in, and then faced the question of what to do about Sienna. He called the number Alara's assistant had given him. Penn answered. "It's Ronan Mercer. Tessa's sick. She can't make it today. I wanted to call early enough that it's not a disruption." He paused. "Tell Sienna it's not because she did anything. She'll worry about that." There was a brief pause on Penn's end. "I'll let Ms. Voss know. Do you want me to cancel?" "Actually," Ronan said, "would it be all right if I still came, just to check in on Sienna?" He was quiet for a second, aware that this was a slightly odd thing to say. Tessa would want someone to be there. She'd feel bad about leaving her hanging. Penn said he'd check and call back. He called back in 4 minutes. Alara said it was fine. Sienna was waiting on the terrace again, but differently. There was a quality to how she was sitting that told Ronan she'd already been informed, because she wasn't looking at the door with expectation. She was looking at the paved area in front of her with the withdrawn expression of someone managing disappointment. He sat down on the low wall across from her. "She's going to be fine," he said. "Ear infection. She has the medicine already." Sienna nodded. She had her hands in her lap. She probably should have brought a jacket last week. It was cold. I mentioned that, Ronan said. She didn't listen. She doesn't listen to a lot of things, Sienna said, without any judgment in it, just observation. No, he agreed. She doesn't. She's very sure of herself. Sienna looked up at that. Is that bad? No, Ronan said. I think it's mostly good, as long as she learns to hear people out. He paused. She's getting better at it. Sienna seemed to consider this. Then she said, I always listened to everyone, every doctor and every therapist. I always did everything they asked. She said it quietly, without resentment, more like she was noting something she'd only recently begun to understand about herself. I know, Ronan said. It didn't always help. No, he said. Sometimes the thing you need isn't someone to listen to. She looked at him for a long moment. She had her mother's eyes, that same focused quality, but in Sienna, it hadn't hardened yet into the armor it had become in Alara. It was still just looking. Tessa treats me normal, Sienna said. Yeah. People don't usually do that, even when they're trying to. I know. You do it too, she said. You ask me what I think about things. You know what you think, he said. Seems like a waste not to ask. Sienna was quiet for a moment. Can we draw anyway? She said. That was going to be my next question. He pulled a handful of chalk from his jacket pocket and set it on the pavement in front of her. She leaned forward and selected 2 pieces with the deliberate care of someone choosing the right tool, and then she began to draw. Ronan sat on the wall and watched, and occasionally she'd look up and describe what she was working on, and he'd respond, not with encouragement in the way adults offered encouragement to children, that particular inflection of enthusiasm that was about making the child feel good rather than actually engaging with the work, but just with honest responses. When she drew something that was genuinely good, he said so. When she drew something that wasn't working, he said that too, and she didn't seem to mind. She drew a bridge. Not a simple bridge, a suspension bridge, with towers and cables, rendered with a precision that was surprising for a 6-year-old. She'd been looking at pictures of bridges, she explained. She wanted to understand how they stayed up. Tension, Ronan said. The cables pull in both directions at the same time. That's what holds it. Sienna looked at the drawing. That doesn't make sense. Pulling in 2 directions should make it fall. Yeah, but the pulling is what keeps it balanced. If one side stopped, the whole thing would go. He thought for a moment. Like a tug of war where nobody wins. That's what holds it up. She stared at the drawing for a long while. Then she added something to the cable line, a small adjustment, thickening it slightly, as if she was correcting for the tension. My mom wants to be sure about everything before she believes it, Sienna said, seemingly to the bridge. That's not the worst way to be, Ronan said. She believes in the tests, the scans and things. She kept drawing. But she cried last week. I heard her in her office after I was supposed to be in bed. She doesn't usually do that. Ronan said nothing. She's scared, Sienna said. She tries not to be, but she is. She looked up. Are you ever scared? He thought about answering around it, and then didn't. Yes, he said. Different things scare me now than used to. Like what? Tessa getting hurt, missing something important, making the wrong call when someone I care about is depending on me. He looked at the bridge drawing. Big obvious danger doesn't scare me much. It's the things you can't see coming. Sienna nodded like she understood that, which, he thought, she probably did. Alara appeared in the doorway from the building and stopped when she saw them. Sienna drawing with serious focus, Ronan sitting on the wall, both of them in some conversation she'd arrived in the middle of. She stayed in the doorway and didn't announce herself. Ronan saw her. He didn't indicate it. Sienna added a final cable to the bridge and sat back. Done, she said. That's a good bridge, Ronan said. It's not done. The towers need windows. She looked at the chalk in her hand. But this one's too thick for windows. Next week, he said, Tessa will bring the thin ones. Sienna smiled at that. A small, real smile, not a performance. The kind that arrived because it couldn't help it. Alara stepped back from the doorway before either of them could turn and see her face. She found him in the lobby 20 minutes later when he was leaving. She talked to you, Alara said. He stopped. He hadn't heard her come up behind him, which in itself was something. He generally heard people coming. She'd been quiet, Or he'd been thinking. She usually talks to me, he said. About me. He looked at her. She was holding a coffee cup and her posture was the precisely managed kind that meant she was working at it. She talked about the bridge, he said, and she asked me some things. What things? Whether I was scared of things. He held the lobby door for a moment. She's thinking about you. She hears things. He paused. She's not worried about herself as much as she's worried about you. Ilara's jaw did the thing he'd noticed before. The slight set of it, the internal argument happening behind a controlled face. She's 6, Ilara said. Yeah, Ronan said. Kids pay attention. I don't want her carrying that. Then you might need to let her see that you're okay sometimes. Not performing okay. Actually, okay. He said it without roughness, but without cushioning it either. She's smart. She knows the difference. Ilara looked at him with an expression that was somewhere between irritated and raw, and he understood that nobody talked to her like this, that the people in her life were too managed or too employed to say the direct thing. You barely know me, she said. I know, he said. Doesn't change what I said. She didn't respond to that. She was looking at something past him, the lobby, the door, some middle distance. I had a meeting Thursday with a child development specialist, she said, Dr. Amara Reeves. She works with kids in rehabilitation settings. I asked her to come in and observe Sienna. Okay, she said almost exactly what you said, the second day. She looked at him. That Sienna's been so surrounded by clinical intervention that she's learned to present as a patient, to manage herself for the adults around her instead of just being a child. Her voice was flat, but there was something underneath it. She said the most therapeutic thing we could do was reduce the therapeutic environment. That's a good doctor, Ronan said. It's 3 years late, Ilara said. He didn't argue that because it was true, and she knew it was true, and arguing it wouldn't help either of them. What are you going to do with it? He asked. She looked at him directly. I'm going to change some things, she said. What those things are, I'm still working out. Okay, he said. I'd like to keep the Saturdays going, she said. Even when Tessa is sick. Today was... She stopped. Good for Sienna. Yeah, he said. She drew a bridge. I know, she showed me after you left. Something softened in her face for a moment. She explained to me about the tension, how the pulling in both directions is what holds it up. She figured that out herself, Ronan said. I know she did. Ilara looked down at the coffee cup in her hands. I think that's the first time in a while she explained something to me instead of the other way around. He didn't say anything. She wasn't looking for a response. Outside, a gust of wind moved through the gap between buildings and rattled the lobby doors in their frames. And somewhere across the street, a cab horn went off and was immediately answered by another. And the ordinary machinery of the city kept doing what it did, indifferent and reliable. I'll see you next Saturday, Ronan said. Yes, she said. He left. She stood in the lobby with her coffee for a while after the door closed, and Penn found her there 3 minutes later and asked about the afternoon schedule. And she said, fine, yes, whatever was on it, and walked back toward the elevator. Well, the weeks that followed had their own rhythm, the kind that builds without anyone naming it. Saturdays became fixed. Tessa's ear infection cleared in 5 days, and she was back the following weekend with the thin chalks and a new idea. The kingdom needed a harbor, she'd decided, because Sienna's bridge should go somewhere. Sienna had spent the week drawing bridge variations in a sketchbook her mother had brought home, and she had specific opinions about span ratios that she could not have articulated technically but understood intuitively, and the two of them argued about the harbor's placement with a seriousness that Ronan found genuinely funny. Ilara stayed closer on those Saturdays, not hovering. She'd made a real effort to stop that, and he could see the effort it cost her, but present. Sometimes she sat near Ronan on the wall and they talked. Not about Sienna, mostly. About other things. She asked him once about the work, the logistics job, the night shifts, and he told her honestly that it was not interesting work, but it was honest work, and the hours were predictable in their way, and she listened without the polite performance of someone who was waiting for the conversation to be over. She told him once, out of nowhere, that she'd started Voss Technologies at 22 with $40,000 she'd borrowed from a friend and a business plan she'd revised 47 times. Not 46, she said. 47, I know because I kept them all. He'd asked why, and she'd said that she wanted to be able to look back at every decision, even the bad ones, especially the bad ones. That sounds exhausting, he said. It is, she said, with a directness that surprised a laugh out of him. She had a way of saying things plainly that he hadn't expected from someone in her position. He'd expected more management, more distance. What he found was someone who had organized her life so precisely around control and outcomes that genuine ease had become genuinely foreign to her. She wasn't performing the distance. She'd built it because at some point it was the only thing that worked. He understood that. He'd built his own version of it. He just built his lower to the ground. In the 5th week, Sienna arrived at the terrace and didn't wait for Tessa to start drawing. She had her chalk out before her wheelchair had fully stopped, and she was adding to the harbor layout with the focused intensity of someone who'd been thinking about it all week, which she had. Tessa arrived 4 minutes later. They'd been stuck in a school pickup that ran late. And instead of being offended that Sienna had started without her, she just studied what had been added and said, "The lighthouse is wrong. It's too far from the water." "It's close enough to the water," Sienna said. "It needs to be closer. Otherwise, it's just a tall building." "Lighthouses aren't always on the water. Some of them are elevated." "Then we need to say it's elevated. Otherwise, people will think it's just a mistake." They looked at each other across the drawing. Some negotiation passed between them that required no further words. And then Tessa sat down and Sienna leaned forward, and they added a small cliff beneath the lighthouse, and the problem was resolved. Ronan was watching this from the wall. He became aware, without looking, that Alara had moved closer and was watching too. "She argued," Alara said quietly, from beside him. "Yeah. Sienna doesn't usually argue, not with other kids." She gives in. "Not with Tessa," he said. "No." There was something in her voice, not quite wonder, something more careful than wonder. "She holds her ground with Tessa." "Because Tessa respects it," Ronan said. "She doesn't treat it like a problem that Sienna has opinions. She treats it like a conversation." Alara was quiet for a moment. She was watching her daughter lean forward over the drawing with her jaw set and her chalk moving with purpose, and whatever she was feeling, she kept it contained the way she kept most things. Closely held, carefully managed, leaking only in the eyes if you were paying attention. Ronan was paying attention. "She's been practicing standing," Alara said, very quietly. "At home. With the parallel bars in the therapy room. She asked to start again last week. She stopped asking 8 months ago." "She wanted to stop?" "She said it didn't feel like anything, that she was just doing it because we wanted her to." She paused. "She wanted to start again on her own." He nodded. "Kessler wants to move her into a more intensive physical therapy schedule, but I'm going to let her lead it." She said that last part like she was making a commitment out loud rather than reporting a decision. "Good," he said. Down on the pavement, Sienna had switched to the thin chalk and was adding detail to something near the harbor entrance. "A small market," she explained to Tessa, "because harbors needed somewhere to buy fish." Tessa said she didn't like fish. Sienna said the market would have other things. Tessa said fine, but could there also be a bakery? Because harbors and stories always had bakeries near the water, she didn't know why. It was just a thing. Sienna said there could be a bakery and added it with 3 economical strokes of chalk that captured something in the proportions that was genuinely right. "She's really good," Ronan said. "I know," Alara said. "I've always known." She said it quietly, and there was something in it that was half pride and half guilt. The specific blend of a parent who recognized a gift and wondered if the circumstances had let it be enough. He didn't say anything to that. Some things didn't need answering. They stood side by side at the wall while the girls worked, while the November afternoon moved toward its early dark, while the city below them made its constant sound, and neither of them filled the silence. Because by now they'd both figured out that the silence between them was one of the few places neither of them had to manage anything. It wasn't a clean thing, what was building between them. It didn't have a name yet, and neither of them was in a hurry to give it one. It was just 2 people who had both, in their different ways, learned to carry more than they let show. Standing at the edge of something they hadn't planned and hadn't prepared for. Watching their daughters build a world on the ground together, chalk-dusted and deliberate, and entirely their own. The name came out in December, 6 weeks after the Saturdays had begun, and it came from a direction Ronan hadn't been watching. He was at work when it happened, a Wednesday night, close to 2 in the morning, The dock quiet in the particular way it got when the last truck had been cleared and the counts were being reconciled and everyone was moving slow with the specific tiredness of people who were almost done but not quite. Pruitt had gone to his office. Darnell was running the final inventory check. Ronan was at the dock door, logging seal numbers, when his phone buzzed with a news notification. He almost didn't open it. The headline read, Voss Technologies CEO linked to controversy over adaptive research contract. Disability advocates call for transparency. He stood at the dock door in the cold and read the article in full. The substance of it was this. Voss Technologies had, 3 years prior, entered into a research partnership with a medical devices firm called Cortigen Solutions. Cortigen's focus was neural interface technology for mobility-impaired patients. The partnership had been structured in a way that gave Voss significant IP rights to research findings, and a disability advocacy organization called the Harlan Access Coalition had obtained documents suggesting that some of the clinical trial data from Cortigen's adaptive mobility research had been selectively shared. Findings that supported commercial applications moved forward, while findings that suggested non-commercial interventions were effective were not published. The article did not accuse Alara of direct wrongdoing. It was careful, but it named her company, and it named Sienna in a way that made Ronan's jaw tighten, a line that noted, almost as an aside, that the CEO's own daughter had a mobility impairment, and that questions had been raised about whether personal financial interest in commercial solutions had shaped the research priorities. He put the phone in his pocket and finished logging the seal numbers. He didn't call her that night. He thought about it on the drive home, and he thought about it while he checked on Tessa, sleeping with her arm thrown over the edge of the bed, the way she always slept, completely committed. And he thought about it while he made himself a cup of coffee. He didn't need and sat at the kitchen table in the quiet of 3 in the morning. What he was working out wasn't whether it was true. He didn't know if it was true. What he was working out was whether he'd been wrong about her, and how you measure that when you've only known someone for 6 weeks. And all of it has been in the soft context of Saturday mornings and children drawing on pavement. He thought about the way she'd sat across from him in that office and said, the background check wasn't something she was going to apologize for. He thought about the way she'd looked at Sienna after the neural report came back, in the lobby of the medical annex, alone with the cold coffee. He thought about standing at the wall while the girls drew, and the way she'd said, I'm going to let her lead it, like a commitment she was making to herself more than to him. None of that answered the question the article was asking. He went to bed. She called him the next morning before 8. He was getting Tessa ready for school, braiding her hair, which he was competent at in the functional sense, but not particularly skilled at, and Tessa had accepted years ago that her father's braids were slightly uneven and that this was just a feature of her life. When the phone rang with Alara's number. Hold on, he told Tessa. Don't move your head. I wasn't moving my head, Tessa said. He finished the braid with one hand and answered with the other. I saw it, he said, before she could speak. There was a beat of silence. I was going to explain. You don't have to explain anything to me, he said. He walked to the kitchen, out of Tessa's range. But I want to know if it's true. Which part? The part about suppressing the research. Another pause, longer this time. He could hear her breathing, controlled and deliberate, the way people breathe when they're managing something they don't want to mishandle. The partnership with Cortigen was a business arrangement, she said. The IP structure was standard for that kind of deal. We didn't direct their research priorities. We didn't tell them what to publish. She paused. What happened was that Cortigen made internal decisions about which findings to advance, and those decisions aligned with commercial viability. And because we held a stake in the outcome, the advocacy group is drawing a line between those two things. Are they wrong to draw it? The pause this time had a different quality. No, she said. They're not wrong that the incentive structure existed. They're wrong that I personally made those calls. But the incentive structure, that was mine. I built it. Ronan leaned against the kitchen counter. Okay, he said. That's all you're going to say? What do you want me to say? I don't know, she said, which he believed because she sounded genuinely uncertain. And she was not a person who sounded genuinely uncertain very often. I wanted you to hear it from me, before you read more of what other people are going to write about it. I read the article last night, he said. The part about Sienna. I know.
Her voice went tight. That's the part that... She stopped, started again. She doesn't know yet. I'm going to have to talk to her. She's going to hear things at some point. I know that. She handles more than you think she does. Ronan. There was an edge in it. Not anger at him, anger at the situation, which she was choosing not to direct at him, which he noticed. I know my daughter. I know you do, he said simply. There was a long pause. The board is calling a meeting for Friday, she said. The advocacy group wants a public response by end of week. My PR team wants me in 3 different interviews. And somewhere in all of that, I have to find a way to sit down with a 6-year-old and explain. She stopped. I don't know how to explain it to her.
Tell her the truth, Ronan said. The version she can hold. You don't have to give her everything. Just don't give her a story that isn't real. She'll ask me if I did something wrong. Did you? A beat. Not the way they're saying, but yes, in another way, yes. Then tell her that, he said, that you made decisions that had consequences you didn't fully think through. Kids understand that. They do it every day. Alara was quiet for long enough that he wondered if the call had dropped. Then she said, You make it sound simple. It's not simple, he said. It's just honest. He could hear her exhale slowly on the other end. Can Saturday still happen? She said. I know it's a lot to ask. With all of this, Saturday still happens, he said. Unless you don't want it to. I want it to. Then we'll be there. He hung up and went back to the living room, where Tessa was examining her braid in the hallway mirror with the evaluative expression of someone who had long since made peace with imperfection. Who was that? She asked. Sienna's mom. Tessa looked at him in the mirror. Is Sienna okay? She's fine. Sienna's fine. Tessa looked at the braid again. This one side is a little lumpy. Yeah, Ronan said. Sorry. It's okay, she said. It gives it character. The week that followed was not a good week for Alara Voss in any of the ways that were public-facing. The board meeting on Friday was 4 hours long and generated nothing useful except a shared understanding that no one wanted to be the one seen as insufficiently concerned. The PR team produced 3 draft statements, none of which Alara approved, because all 3 of them were written in the particular language of people managing a story rather than addressing one. And she had decided, somewhere between Wednesday and Thursday, somewhere in the space of a conversation with Ronan Mercer that she kept returning to without meaning to, that she was done managing the story. She wrote her own statement. It was 6 paragraphs. It acknowledged the incentive structure, said clearly that the commercial alignment of the Cortigen partnership had created conditions that should not have existed, committed to a full independent audit of all published and unpublished research from the partnership period, and established a $50 million fund to support non-commercial disability research with open publication requirements. Her legal team read it and said it was too direct. She published it anyway. The response split roughly how she'd expected. Some found it insufficient, some found it surprisingly candid. Some were waiting for the audit results before deciding. What mattered to Alara was not the response. What mattered was that she'd said a true thing in true language, which she hadn't done publicly in a long time, and the particular discomfort of that honesty felt less like exposure than like something she'd put down that she'd been carrying without noticing the weight. She talked to Sienna on Thursday evening. She brought her to the library off the main hall, Sienna's favorite room in the apartment, full of oversized art books and a reading chair near the window that Sienna had claimed as hers years ago. And she sat on the ottoman across from the chair and told her daughter the truth in the version a 6-year-old could hold. She said that she had made a deal with a company that was supposed to help children like Sienna. She said the deal had been set up in a way that might have meant some important information didn't get shared the way it should have. She said she hadn't done it on purpose, but that she was responsible for how things were set up, and that when you're responsible for something, the outcomes belong to you even when you didn't intend them. She said she was going to fix it. Sienna listened through all of it with the serious attention she gave everything that mattered. When Alara finished, Sienna was quiet for a moment. Were the children hurt? She asked. I don't know yet, Alara said. That's what the audit is going to find out. What's an audit? It's when you go back through everything and check what actually happened. Sienna thought about that. Like when I go back and look at a drawing to see what's wrong with it. Exactly like that. Sienna pulled at a thread on the reading chair's armrest, a habit she had when she was thinking. You said you were responsible even though you didn't mean it. Yes. Like if I knocked something over by accident, it's still my mess. Yes, Elara said. Like that. Sienna nodded slowly. Then she said, Tessa knocked my chalk off the wall one time and she said sorry and fixed it. She didn't make a big deal. That's a good way to handle it, Elara said. Yeah, Sienna said. I think so too. She looked at her mother steadily. Are you going to fix it? I'm going to try. Sienna seemed to find that acceptable. She picked up one of the art books from beside the chair and opened it to a page she had bookmarked, a photograph of a painted ceiling, massive and detailed, and said, I want to draw a ceiling painting someday, like a floor that you look up at. Elara stayed on the ottoman for a moment, looking at her daughter, and something in her chest did the thing it had been doing since the first Saturday in Riverside Park, tightening and releasing, like a knot working itself loose that had been there so long she'd stopped feeling it. That's a good idea, she said. I know, Sienna said, and turned the page. Saturday arrived gray and cold, the kind of December cold that was serious about itself. Ronan and Tessa showed up with a thermos of hot chocolate. Tessa had insisted, on the grounds that it was cold enough to need it. And Tessa was wearing a new jacket that fit her properly, a red one with a hood, which she'd chosen herself from 3 options Ronan had laid out on the kitchen table. Sienna was on the terrace in a heavier version of her usual setup, a wool blanket over her lap, her breath visible in the air. She had brought the sketchbook, which she'd been keeping as a record of the terrace kingdom, rough drawings, notes in her own version of handwriting, measurements that weren't quite accurate but reflected real thinking. Tessa looked at the sketchbook and made an appreciative sound. You mapped the whole thing. In case it rains and the chalk disappears, Sienna said, we'll know where everything goes. That's really smart, Tessa said. I know, Sienna said. Ronan set the thermos on the wall and poured cups for both girls and then looked at Elara, who had come out behind him and was wearing a coat that was finally appropriate for the weather rather than just stylish, and he poured a cup for her and one for himself. She took it with both hands. Thank you. Yeah. They stood at the wall while the girls worked. The cold made the chalk marks differently on the pavement, slightly more resistant, the color a little less vivid, but Sienna had already adapted to this and was using a heavier pressure to compensate, which Ronan noticed and said nothing about because she'd figured it out herself. The statement went out, he said. I know, I wrote it. I read it. She glanced at him sideways. And? It was honest, he said. It was the right thing. She looked back at the girls. My legal counsel is still not speaking to me in full sentences. He'll get over it. She, Elara said. And probably not, but that's all right. She wrapped both hands tighter around the cup. I've been thinking about the Cortigen research. The Open Publication Fund is a start. But there are programs, existing programs, community-based ones, that have been doing work that never got institutional attention because there was no commercial application, no IP to license, no return on investment. She was talking in the way people talk when they've been working through something for days and it's finally come to the surface. I want to look at those programs, not to acquire them, to support them. Actually support them with money that doesn't come with strings. That's a significant change from how you usually work, Ronan said. Yes, she said. It is. He drank his coffee. She drank hers. There was a program in Sienna's early treatment records, she said more quietly. A community recreation initiative, adaptive arts, outdoor therapy, mixed age group participation. Her first specialist recommended it. I chose a private specialist program instead because it had better facilities and more credentialed staff. She stopped. The recreation initiative had better outcomes for kids in Sienna's profile range. It was in the literature. I just didn't look at the literature. I looked at the credentials. You made the best call you knew how to make, Ronan said. I made the call that felt like control, she said. There's a difference. He didn't argue that either. Below on the pavement, Tessa was arguing that the kingdom needed a school. Sienna was resisting on the grounds that schools in kingdoms were usually called academies, and they should use the right word. Tessa said, fine, academy, same thing. Sienna said it wasn't the same thing, but okay. They started drawing the academy in a space near the harbor's edge, Tessa doing the large outline, Sienna filling in the details. She's been standing more, Elara said, still watching. At the parallel bars. Kessler did the assessment last Tuesday. She held her own weight on both feet for 11 seconds. 11 consecutive seconds. She said the number the way you say a number that has weight to it. 8 weeks ago, that wasn't possible. I know, Ronan said. She told me she wants to walk to Tessa when she's ready. That's her goal. She said it like it was simple. Alara's voice was steady, but just barely. She said she wants to walk across the room and hand her the chalk back. Ronan looked at the girls. Tessa was explaining something about the academy's entrance. Sienna was listening, chalk in hand, expression focused. She'll do it, he said. I think she will, Alara said. Which is... She stopped. Didn't finish the sentence. Some things didn't need finishing. They were quiet for a while. Can I ask you something? Alara said. Sure. Why did you walk away from the military? He'd been expecting a different question. He was quiet for a moment, not avoiding it. He was just finding the honest version rather than the easy one. There was a mission, he said. Last one I was part of. It went the way it was supposed to. Target was neutralized. Everyone on our side came home. He looked down at the cup in his hands. And I realized after that I'd been telling myself for years that the line was clear. That I always knew which side of it I was on. And after that mission, I wasn't sure anymore. Not about what happened, about what I'd become comfortable with. He paused. I didn't want to be that person. I wanted to figure out who I was when I wasn't operating. Alara was quiet. It took a while, he said. The year after was not a good year. I was not easy to be around. He almost said something more about Tessa's mother and then didn't, because that was a longer story than the moment needed. But you came through it, Alara said. More or less, he said. It's not... I didn't resolve everything. I just got to a place where I could function without the functioning being the whole point. She looked at him. That's not nothing. No, he said. It isn't. The gray sky was holding. The cold stayed consistent. Sienna reached forward over the academy drawing to add a detail, and her blanket shifted, and Tessa grabbed it and tucked it back around her lap, without breaking the conversation she was having about where to put the windows, which was so natural and so unremarkable that neither girl acknowledged it. Alara made a small sound beside him. Sorry, she said a second later. Don't apologize, Ronan said. She didn't say anything to that. She pressed her lips together once and looked at the city beyond the wall, at the December gray of it, the way the buildings held the light, and returned it diffused and flat. And her eyes were too bright in the way that eyes get when someone is not going to cry, but their body has entered the anteroom of it. He didn't look away. He didn't look directly at her either. He just stayed where he was, which was, he'd come to understand, what she needed more than anything offered or solved. The board called a second meeting in the third week of December. This one was less fraught than the first. The public statement had been received better than legal had predicted. The audit announcement had satisfied the advocacy group enough to pause their campaign pending results. And two institutional investors who had called for an extraordinary review had quietly pulled back their requests. The commercial situation was stable. The reputational situation was healing. What the board wanted to discuss now was the $50 million commitment. 3 board members were supportive, 2 were neutral. 1, a man named Gerald Forrester, who had been on the board for 9 years and considered himself the institutional memory of the organization, had concerns. The fund is fine in principle, Forrester said. Non-commercial disability research, open publication, I have no objection to the intent. What I want to understand is the operational structure. Because, Alara, you're talking about a significant philanthropic commitment that doesn't sit inside our existing foundation architecture. And I'm aware, Alara said. And if you're proposing to build a new structure, we need to talk about governance, about who's directing. I know who's directing it, she said. The room went quiet the way rooms go quiet when the CEO says something that has more certainty in it than the conversation has yet established. You have someone in mind, said Dorothea Chen, the board chair, who had a talent for reading rooms. I do, Alara said. Someone with direct experience working with children in exactly the context this fund is designed to support. Not a clinician, not an administrator. Someone who understands what gets missed when you run everything through a clinical or commercial lens. Credentials? Forrester asked. Real-world results, Alara said, which, given that our credentialed approach over the past 3 years is the reason we're having this conversation, I'd suggest we weigh seriously. Forrester opened his mouth and Dorothea said, "Alara, are you going to tell us who you're talking about, or are we going to work up to it?" "His name is Ronan Mercer," she said. "Former Navy SEAL, single father, currently working nights at a logistics center." She let that sit. "He spent 2 hours in a park in October doing what 3 years of specialized intervention didn't. I want him involved in building this program because he understands something that I didn't understand until recently." "What's that?" Dorothea asked. "That the children we're trying to help aren't problems to be optimized," Alara said. "They're children." The room was quiet again. Forrester leaned back. "A warehouse worker," he said. "A logistics professional," Alara said, without inflection. "With a skill set that goes considerably beyond that and an understanding of how to be present with people in difficult circumstances that most of our current staff does not have." She looked around the table. "I'm not asking for a vote on his hiring today. I'm informing the board of my intent, which is within my authority as CEO. I wanted to have this conversation because I believe the fund is important, and I want the board aligned on why." Dorothea was looking at her with an expression Alara couldn't fully classify. "You've changed your approach," Dorothea said. "Not a criticism, an observation." "Yes," Alara said. "I have." She didn't explain further. She didn't need to. She called Ronan that evening after Sienna was in bed. He was doing something in the kitchen. She could hear the particular ambient noise of someone moving around in a small space, opening a cabinet, setting something down. "I told my board about you today," she said. A pause. The cabinet sound stopped. "About me. About what I want you to do, with the fund." She hadn't fully worked out how she was going to say this part. "I know I should have asked you first. I'm asking you now. It just went in a direction in the meeting." "What did you tell them I would do?" "Help build a community program, adaptive recreation, arts, the kind of environment that—" She paused. "The kind of environment you created in a park with a piece of chalk, but with structure behind it, with funding and real space and kids who need exactly what Sienna found that Saturday." She stopped. "I'm not explaining it right." "No, I understand," he said. "You'd be the director, real salary, real title. You'd have autonomy over the program model. I won't run it like a company project." He was quiet for long enough that she wondered what he was doing. "Tessa would be interested in your ceiling," he said. "Sorry?" "Sienna told Tessa she wants to draw a ceiling painting someday. Tessa said she'd help." He paused. "You'd need to actually mean the autonomy part. I won't run it according to metrics that don't apply to what kids need." "I know that. And if I see something that's not working, I tell you directly and you listen." "Yes." "Even if what's not working is something you set up." "Yes," she said. "Ronan." "Yes." He was quiet again for a shorter time. "Okay," he said. "Okay?" "Yeah, okay." He paused. "I want Tessa to be able to come sometimes, not as a program participant, just that she'd want to be part of what gets built." "Of course," Alara said. "Of course she would." She stood at the window of her home office. The same window, 42 floors up, the city laid out below. And she felt something she hadn't felt in years, which was that she was going somewhere she hadn't planned on going, and it didn't feel like losing control. It felt like something she didn't have an exact word for, close to forward, close to real. "Saturday," Ronan said. "Saturday," she said. She hung up and stood at the window for a while longer, and didn't reach for the tablet or the phone or any of the 100 other things she usually reached for when she had a spare moment. And the city below her did what it always did, moved and lit up and kept going. And for the first time in a long time, she did not feel like she was watching it from the outside. January came in hard. The city got its first real snow of the season on the second day of the new year. Not the decorative kind that dusted rooftops and made people post photographs, but the heavy, committed kind that meant business, that packed into the gutters and turned the sidewalks gray-white and required actual effort. Ronan shoveled the front steps of the Calverton building before 6 in the morning, which was not his responsibility, but which he did anyway because old Doris had a bad hip and the super had a habit of getting to things eventually. Tessa watched him from the lobby window in her pajamas, breath fogging the glass. When he came back in, she handed him a mug of hot chocolate that she'd made herself, which was mostly milk with a quantity of cocoa powder that indicated she'd been generous with the measuring. "It's strong," she warned him. I can see that, he said. Strong is better in winter. He drank it and didn't argue. He was thinking about the building. He'd been given access to the space in the third week of December, a former community arts center in the Garfield district that had been sitting half empty for 2 years, owned by a nonprofit that was happy to enter a long-term lease arrangement with the Voss Foundation in exchange for operational support. 3 floors. Old hardwood on the main level. Big windows. The kind of space that had been something once and knew it could be something again. He'd walked through it 3 times before he'd said yes, not because he was uncertain, because he wanted to be sure he was saying yes to the right thing and not to the version of it that someone else had imagined for him. The first time he walked through it, Ilara had come with him. She'd been quiet, mostly, letting him move through the rooms at his own pace, which he appreciated. She'd made one comment about a back room that she thought could be converted to a sensory integration space. And he'd said maybe, let's see what the kids need first, and she'd said fine, and hadn't brought it up again. The second time he walked through it, he brought Tessa. Tessa had stood in the center of the main room, high ceilings, the afternoon light coming in flat and gray through the big windows, and turned in a slow circle. The ceiling, she said. What about it? It's big enough. He looked up. The ceiling was high and broad and painted in that institutional off-white that was neither a choice nor the absence of one. Big enough for what? He asked, though he already knew. For Sienna's painting, Tessa said. She said she wanted to draw a ceiling painting. This ceiling is big enough for a real one. Ronan looked at the ceiling for a long moment. It'd have to be painted, he said, not chalk. She can paint, Tessa said. She's been doing watercolors. I've seen them. She looked at him with the particular patience of someone waiting for the slow person to catch up. Dad, the ceiling. The third time he walked through it, he went alone, early on a Tuesday morning when the Garfield district was still waking up and the building was cold and quiet and smelled of old wood and something mineral he couldn't identify. He stood in the main room and looked at the ceiling and thought about what Tessa had said, and then he thought about a 6-year-old girl in a wheelchair at the edge of a chalk circle, saying she loved drawing, saying it quietly, like it was something she kept small so it would be safe. He called Ilara from the parking lot. The Garfield building, he said. I want to move forward. Okay, she said. There was something in her voice that wasn't surprise, more like the particular satisfaction of someone who'd been waiting for a door to open rather than forcing it. I'll have the lease finalized by end of week. There's something specific I want to do with the main room, he said. Tell me. He told her about the ceiling. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, that's going to require a professional painter to prep the surface, and scaffolding. I know. And a design plan because you can't just... Ilara. Right, she said. Okay, I'll make it work. The Chalk Circle Initiative, which was what they decided to call it, simply and without ceremony, opened its doors on the 15th of March, which was still cold enough to need a coat, but had that particular early spring quality of light that made everything look like it was considering a change. The opening was not a gala. Ilara had wanted to do something larger, a launch event, press, the kind of visible commitment that signaled to the world that this was serious, and Ronan had said no, not because he wanted to be difficult, but because he understood something she was still learning, that the children who needed this place didn't care about press, and that making their first experience of it into a media event was the wrong start. We open it, he'd said. We let the first group in. We see what happens. And the visibility piece comes later, when there's something real to show, not a promise, the thing itself. She'd push back on this in the measured, persistent way she pushed back on things she wasn't ready to concede. They'd had the argument in her office over cold coffee and takeout containers from a Thai place Penn had ordered, and then been too polite to eat in front of them, and it had lasted 40 minutes and ended with Ilara saying, Fine, your call, but I'm bringing a photographer on week 3. Week 4, Ronan said. Week 3, she said. Fine, he said. The first group was 14 children, ages 5 through 11, referred through 3 partner organizations, a pediatric rehab clinic, a public school's special education department, and a community social work agency that served families in 4 of the city's lower-income districts. Mixed diagnoses, mixed backgrounds, different levels of mobility and communication. The one thing they had in common was that they had all, in various ways, been defined primarily by their limitations rather than their personhood, and their parents were exhausted and hopeful in the specific combination that belongs to people who have been fighting for a long time. Sienna was not part of the first group. Ronan and Ilara had both decided, independently, and then confirmed with each other, that it would be wrong, that Sienna's presence as the CEO's daughter would change the dynamic in ways that were hard to predict and harder to undo. Sienna had been told about the center, had been part of several conversations about what it should be, and had contributed 3 design drawings for the main room's layout with annotations in her careful handwriting. She knew her name was part of the name. She seemed to find this appropriate. "It's the chalk circle," she told Tessa, over the phone, the week before opening. "From the park." "I know," Tessa said. "Dad told me." "I told your dad about it first. He tells me everything." A pause. "Not everything," Sienna said. "Most things," Tessa conceded. Tessa was there on opening day because she'd asked to be and Ronan had said yes, and because she was, in ways that were not on any organizational chart, part of what made this place make sense. She helped set up the art supplies in the main room that morning, arranging them with the systematic logic of someone who had thought about this. Chalks organized by size, paints by color, paper in 2 different weights depending on what the work needed. She laid everything out on the low tables while Ronan moved furniture, and a young woman named Destiny, who was the center's first staff hire and had a background in adaptive recreation therapy, helped with the parallel bars setup in the far room. The first child through the door was a boy named Kyle, 8 years old, cerebral palsy affecting his right side, referred by the school district. He came in with his mother, who had the particular posture of a woman who had been the primary advocate for her child for 8 years, and was carrying the invisible weight of every conversation, every meeting, every form she'd ever had to fill out to prove her son deserved accommodation. She looked at the room. She looked at the tables with the art supplies. She looked at Ronan. "There's no intake form?" she asked. "Not today," he said. "Today he just comes in." She looked at him for a moment like she was checking whether this was real. Then she looked at her son, who had already moved toward the chalk table and was picking up colors with his left hand and setting them back down, checking the density of each piece. "He draws," his mother said quietly. "He's been drawing since he was 4. "I know," Ronan said. "It's in his referral." She nodded. Something moved through her face that wasn't quite relief. Relief was too simple a word for what happened when a parent who had been fighting for a very long time encountered something that simply made room. Tessa appeared from the supply area and sat down at the chalk table across from Kale, not announcing herself, not asking permission. "That red is good," she said, pointing to the piece he'd just set down. "It's got the right weight." Kale looked at her. "How do you know about chalk weight?" "My dad taught me," Tessa said. "Also, I've done a lot of it." Kale considered her. "What do you draw?" "Cities mostly, kingdoms. My friend Sienna and I build them together." "I draw machines," Kale said. "Machines are good," Tessa said. "Can I see one?" And just like that, Kale picked up the chalk. Ronan stood in the doorway of the main room and watched it happen. The first drawings going down on the big paper rolls they'd taped to the low tables. The first voices finding each other across the room. The first negotiations about space and color and what something was supposed to be. It was messy and uneven. And one child was crying in the far corner because the transition had been too much, and Destiny was sitting with her on the floor, not fixing it, just being there. And it was, in all of its imperfection and noise, exactly what it was supposed to be. He thought about the warehouse, about 2 years of night shifts and seal numbers, and Pruitt's particular talent for appearing at the wrong moment. He didn't miss it. He didn't hate it either. It had been honest work, and he'd done it honestly, and it had kept Tessa fed and clothed and in a school she liked. You didn't have to hate the hard thing to be glad the hard thing was over. He thought about the mission he'd never talked about, the one he'd described to Ilara only in outline, the line he'd felt himself crossing, the discomfort that had arrived afterward like a delayed bill he'd known was coming. He'd spent years after that discharge not exactly running from it, but not turning toward it either. He'd built the quiet life because quiet was what he needed, and somewhere in the quiet Tessa had grown up into herself, this complete, opinionated, chalk-carrying person. And he'd been grateful for the quiet for that reason too. He didn't know, back in October, what he was walking into when he took his daughter to a park on a Saturday morning. He hadn't been thinking about anything larger than grapes and a water bottle, and whether the fountain was still broken. Life didn't announce the things that were going to matter. It just put them in front of you while you were looking at something else. Cale's machine was taking shape on the paper. A detailed assembly of interlocking parts that suggested he understood how things fit together in ways that weren't yet fully nameable, but were completely real. Tessa was watching it develop with the attentive silence she reserved for things she found genuinely impressive, which she offered less often than she offered opinions. "What does it do?" she asked. Cale thought about this. "I haven't decided yet. Sometimes I draw the machine first and figure out what it does after." "That's backwards," Tessa said. "Not really," Cale said. "You figure out what something does by building it first. Then you see." Tessa stared at him for a moment. Then she picked up her chalk. "Okay," she said. "Show me." Alara came on the third day. Not to inspect. Not in the CEO capacity, or not entirely. She came because Ronan had called her the evening of the first day and said, "It's going well. You should see it." And she'd said she had 3 meetings in the morning, and he'd said after the meetings then, and she'd said she'd see. And she came at 11 on Wednesday morning in a coat that was slightly too formal for the neighborhood, but significantly less formal than her usual range, which was its own kind of progress. Ronan met her at the door. She looked at the building from the outside. The new sign, simple, black text on white. The Chalk Circle Initiative, Garfield Arts Center. She looked at it for a moment before she went in. "It's real," she said. "Yeah," he said. "I mean, I knew it was real. I signed the checks." She looked at him. "I mean, it looks like it was always supposed to be here." He held the door. Inside, this morning group was already deep into their work. 6 children today, a different mix from the first session, younger this time, 3 of them 5-year-olds who were doing something at the floor-level paper with a level of physical commitment that had already resulted in chalk dust on 2 jackets and someone's knee. Destiny was moving between them with an ease that came from genuinely liking children rather than from training, which Ronan had been able to see in her the moment she'd interviewed, and which had been the reason he'd hired her over 2 more credentialed candidates. Alara walked slowly through the room. She didn't touch anything. She watched. A girl named Priya, 6 years old, partial vision loss, referred by the pediatric clinic, was working on a drawing of a tree that was unlike any tree Ronan had seen a child draw, because it had the root system as visible as the canopy, both halves given equal weight, the whole thing drawn from some internal knowledge of what trees did underground that most people never thought about. Alara stopped near Priya's table. Priya looked up. "Do you like trees?" she asked. Alara blinked. "I do, actually." "This one has really deep roots," Priya said. "That's why it doesn't fall over in wind." "Tension," Ronan said from behind Alara. She turned slightly. He was watching Priya. "Pulling in both directions is what holds it up," he said. Alara looked at the tree drawing. Then she looked at Ronan. There was something in her expression that was open in a way her face wasn't usually open, the armor she wore so consistently that it had stopped reading as armor and just read as her. It had thinned, standing in this room, in a way that made her look simultaneously more vulnerable and more like herself. "It's good," she said quietly to him. "I know," he said. Sienna came to the center for the first time in April. It was a Sunday. The center was closed on Sundays, formally, but Ronan had a key and Tessa had been lobbying for the ceiling project to actually begin, and Sienna had reached a point in her physical recovery that her therapist described in the weekly report as consistent functional progress with strong motivational engagement, which was clinical language for the fact that she was working harder at the parallel bars than anyone had asked her to, because she had decided she was going to walk across the main room of the Chalk Circle Initiative and hand Tessa the piece of chalk she'd been holding onto since October. She had carried that chalk through the whole winter. It lived in the small bag on her wheelchair, and Tessa knew it was there, and neither of them had mentioned it since the day Sienna had taken it in the park, because some agreements are made without words and are better kept that way. Alara drove them, not in the SUV with Hargrove. Just her own car, which was still an extremely nice car, but which she had started driving herself on weekends in what Ronan had come to understand was her version of making space for ordinary life. Ronan and Tessa were already in the building when they arrived. Tessa had spent the morning mapping the ceiling. She'd borrowed a projector from the supply closet and was working out how to transfer Sienna's design up to scale, which was a problem she found genuinely interesting and had been thinking about since January. Sienna came through the door in her wheelchair, Elara behind her. She stopped in the doorway of the main room and looked up. The ceiling was still the institutional off-white, but taped along one edge, like a proposal, was a section of paper where Tessa had done a test rendering of Sienna's design. The kingdom, the harbor, the bridge, with its cables under tension, the lighthouse on its cliff, the bakery, marble, the cat with her 3 kittens. All of it expanded and transformed into something bigger than chalk on pavement, something that looked, at this scale, like the thing it had always been trying to be. Sienna stared at it for a long time. "It's bigger than I thought it would be," she said. "Ceilings are," Tessa said. "I measured. It'll take a long time to paint." "We're not in a hurry," Tessa said. "We've been drawing this thing for months already." Sienna looked at the test section again. Then she looked at the room. The tables, the supply shelves, the parallel bars visible through the open door of the far room, the windows with their April light coming in at an angle that caught the dust in the air and made it look like something deliberate. "Can I try?" Sienna said. Ronan looked at her. He knew what she was asking, and it wasn't about the ceiling. "When you're ready," he said. She looked at him steadily. "I'm ready now." He glanced at Elara, who was standing in the doorway with her hands loose at her sides in the deliberate way of someone who had worked hard not to hold them tight. She gave him nothing, no instruction, no permission, no anxiety made visible. She just stood there, which was, he'd come to understand, her version of trusting him. He looked back at Sienna. "Okay," he said. Tessa moved without being asked to the far side of the room. She stood against the wall with her arms slightly out from her sides. Not reaching, just present, just available. And she held the piece of chalk in one hand. The same chalk. The piece from October, white and worn down at one end from a winter of being carried. Sienna moved the wheelchair to the edge of the parallel bars. Her physical therapist, a young man named Torres, who had been working with her 3 times a week since November, was not there. It was a Sunday. It was not a therapy session, and Sienna had been clear with her mother that she didn't want him there for this. She wanted to do it in the room where it mattered, for the reason that mattered, without it being a clinical event. Ronan stood nearby. Not beside her. Nearby, the way he stood near things that needed to happen on their own. Sienna gripped the bars. She pulled herself up. It was not elegant. It was not the kind of standing you saw in rehabilitation brochures, clean and triumphant. It was the hard, effortful, shaking kind. Her arms bearing most of the weight at first, her legs finding the floor in stages, her breath coming in a controlled pattern that Torres had taught her and that she was using now, not because Torres had told her to, but because it worked. She stood, shaking slightly, and she was not pretending it was easy. She looked across the room at Tessa. Tessa was not performing anything. She was just standing there against the wall with the chalk in her hand, watching her friend with the calm, steady attention that was her particular gift. The ability to be fully present without making her presence the thing you were thinking about. "Okay," Sienna said. She took a step. The first one was the hardest. It always is. Not because the body isn't capable. By this point, Kessler's assessments had confirmed consistent and progressive neural pathway restoration, more than anyone had predicted in October, less than Elara had let herself hope for in December, exactly what Sienna had quietly determined was going to happen in January when she'd stood at the parallel bars and decided, but because the first step requires committing your whole weight to the possibility that the next moment will hold you. She took it, and then the next. She was not walking smoothly. She was walking the way someone walks when walking is still an act of will rather than reflex. Measured, deliberate, each step a decision. Her hands came off the bars after the third step, and she was in open space, nothing to hold on to, just the floor and her own legs, and the distance between her and the wall where Tessa was standing with the chalk. Ronan watched her and did not move. Elara, in the doorway, had both hands pressed flat against the frame. Sienna crossed the room. It took a long time. Not in terms of actual seconds, it was maybe 40 feet, and it took perhaps 2 minutes. But in the particular way that time operates when something you have wanted and worked for, and sometimes stopped believing in, is actually happening, where each individual moment seems to expand to contain everything that led to it. She reached Tessa. She stood in front of her, slightly winded, her legs trembling with the effort of it, and she held out her hand. Tessa placed the piece of chalk in her palm. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Sienna looked down at the chalk, worn at one end, still white at the other, smaller than it had been in October. She closed her fingers around it. "Okay," she said. "Yeah," Tessa said. Then Tessa put her arms around her, careful but not fragile, and Sienna let her, and they stood there in the middle of the room in the April light, two children holding each other up. Ronan turned toward the doorway. Alara had both hands over her mouth, and she was looking at her daughter with an expression that was too large for her face to fully contain. Love and guilt and relief, and something that was just wonder, plain and unmanaged, the kind of feeling that gets through when you've stopped defending against it. Her eyes were full, and she wasn't blinking, and she was not, he noticed, trying to make it smaller. He walked to the doorway and stood beside her. She didn't look at him. She couldn't look away from Sienna. "She did it," Alara said. Her voice was barely there. "Yeah," he said. "She actually—" She stopped. There wasn't a sentence for it. "I know," he said. They stood there together at the edge of the room, not touching, just side by side, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her and the cold of the doorway. And the girls in the center of the room were letting go of each other now, and Sienna was looking up at the ceiling, at the test rendering on the paper, the kingdom in progress, the harbor, and the bridge, and marble, the cat, with an expression of clear, decided intention. "We need a ladder," Sienna said. Tessa looked up at the ceiling. "We need scaffolding. I measured. It's too high for a ladder." "Your dad has to get scaffolding." "I know." Tessa looked over at Ronan. "Dad, scaffolding." "I heard," he said. Alara made a sound beside him that was between a laugh and something else, and he turned to look at her. Really look at her, not the managed version she presented to the world. But this version, the one with her defenses down in a room that had made her forget to hold them. And she turned to look at him at the same moment, and what passed between them in that look was not complicated. It was just honest. The way honest things are when you've spent enough time in the same space to stop pretending they aren't there. "Scaffolding," she said. "Scaffolding," he agreed. There are things that money can do and things it can't, and the honest accounting of that gap is something most wealthy people spend considerable energy avoiding. Alara Voss had spent a decade being very good at that avoidance. She had built systems and hired experts and funded initiatives and told herself that resources applied with intelligence and rigor were the most efficient form of care. And she hadn't been entirely wrong. Resources mattered, expertise mattered, rigor mattered. But she had confused the instrument for the thing the instrument was trying to reach. What Sienna had needed was not the absence of resources. What she had needed was the presence of someone who looked at her and saw the whole child. Not the diagnosis, not the challenge, not the project, before they saw anything else. That's not a lesson that announces itself. It doesn't come with a framework or a research citation. It comes, if you're lucky, through a stranger with chalk in his pocket who kneels beside your daughter in a park and asks her what she loves. The audit of the Cortigen partnership concluded in May. Its findings were mixed in the way genuine audits are mixed. Some things that were concerning, some that were within normal parameters. 3 specific instances where internal decisions had prioritized commercial outcomes over complete publication, and a research population of children who deserved to know what the full data showed. Alara published the complete audit. She established individual outreach to every family in the trial population. She dissolved the partnership structure. It was not painless. The stock took a hit for 2 weeks. 2 major investors reduced their positions. Gerald Forrester sent her a long email about optics and fiduciary responsibility that she read and replied to in 5 sentences, and then did not think about further. The Harlan Access Coalition issued a statement saying the response was substantive and that they would be watching the implementation. She was watching it too. Closely, carefully, with the same attention she gave everything she considered her responsibility, which now included a converted arts center in the Garfield district that smelled of chalk and fresh paint, and on Tuesdays and Thursdays when the younger group came in, also of the popcorn Destiny had started making on the hot plate in the supply room because she'd discovered that the smell of popcorn made transitions easier for 3 of the kids, which was not in any clinical literature but was real. The center grew. Not fast, Ronan had been firm about scaling slowly, about not expanding beyond what the staff could hold well, about understanding each group before adding another. By fall, they had 4 weekly sessions, 32 children enrolled across different programs, a waiting list that Ronan reviewed personally every 2 weeks, and a ceiling that was 1/3 painted in the main room, the kingdom spreading out from the corner above the chalk table where it had begun. Sienna was there every Sunday. She walked into the building on her own every time, not without effort, still sometimes using a cane on the harder days, but on her own, and she had stopped thinking of this as extraordinary, the way she'd stopped thinking about the chalk as something she needed to protect. She came in, and she set up her materials, and she worked. The ceiling was hers in the way that projects belong to their originators, the concept, the design, the decisions about what went where and why. Tessa was her collaborator in the way Tessa had always been her collaborator, opinionated, practical, unwilling to defer when she disagreed, and completely committed to making the thing they were building as good as it could be. They argued about the harbor's color palette for 3 separate Sundays before reaching a compromise that both of them considered inferior to their individual preferences, but superior to the absence of agreement. Cale came on Sundays too, eventually. He'd been coming to the Tuesday sessions since March, and somewhere around June, he and Sienna had encountered each other in the main room, and he'd looked at the ceiling and asked who was doing it, and she'd said she was, and he'd looked at the machine section she'd added near the bridge, which incorporated the interlocking parts he'd described as his visual language, transformed into something that powered the harbor's mechanisms. And he'd said that was actually really good. Sienna had said she knew. He'd said he could help with the mechanical parts if she wanted. She'd said she'd think about it. She thought about it for 2 weeks and then told Tessa, who told Ronan, who mentioned it to Cale's mother when she brought him in the following Tuesday. And by August, Cale was on the scaffolding on Sunday mornings with a brush in his left hand and a level of focus that his school had been trying to access for 4 years. In October, on a Saturday that was cold. The way the previous October's Saturday had been cold. Iron fence cold, oak tree cold, the kind of cold that made breath visible and made people pull their coats across themselves without thinking. Ronan and Alara were standing on the terrace of the Voss building after the session, which they still did sometimes, not as a program event but just as a habit they'd kept because it was theirs. The girls were inside. Sienna was showing Tessa something in the sketchbook. They could see them through the glass, heads bent over the page, the Chalk Kingdom's latest iteration laid out between them. "A year," Alara said. "Almost," Ronan said. "It was this month. The park." "Yeah." She looked at the city, not with the removed quality she'd had at the beginning, that 42 floors up distance, watching something through glass. She looked at it with the eyes of someone who had stopped thinking of herself as separate from it. "I owe you an apology," she said. He looked at her. "For what?" "For the background check," she said. "I know I acknowledged it at the time. I said it wasn't something I was going to apologize for, but I was wrong about that." She didn't dress it up. It was the move of someone who categorizes people before she lets herself respond to them. "I did it because I was scared, and I covered the fear with efficiency." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm not holding that against you." "I know," she said. "I'm telling you anyway." He nodded. "I've been thinking about what you said," she said, "back in the beginning, that Sienna needed to be seen as a child first." Yeah. It was true, and it applied to more than Sienna. She glanced at him. "I'd been so focused on her as a problem to solve that I'd stopped being her mother in any way that felt natural. Everything was managed. Everything was structured." She paused. "She needed me to just be with her, and I didn't know how to do that without it being an agenda." "You know now," he said. "I'm learning," she said. "There's a difference." He almost smiled. "Fair point." They stood in the particular comfortable quiet that had taken months to build, and which neither of them would have been able to articulate the value of to someone who hadn't experienced it. The quiet of 2 people who had stopped performing anything for each other, who had run out of reasons to manage their presentation and discovered, in the absence of it, that they actually liked who they were looking at. "I talked to Tessa," Alara said. He turned slightly. "About what?" "About whether she'd mind if things changed." She kept her eyes on the city. "Between us." He was quiet. "She said,"
Alara continued, and I'm quoting directly, obviously, Mom. And then she corrected herself and said, I mean, Ms. Voss. And then she seemed to realize that was weird given the context, and she gave up and went back to the sketchbook. Ronan looked through the glass at his daughter, who was emphatically explaining something to Sienna with the full use of both hands. She called you Mom, he said. She did. Alara's voice was careful,
Feeling out the edges of the thing. I don't think she meant to. It just came out. He looked at the girls for a long moment. Sienna had taken the pen from Tessa and was correcting something on the page, and Tessa was watching with that expression she used when she was deciding whether or not to agree with a revision. She's been calling Doris Grandma since she was 4, he said. Doris has been correcting her for 3 years. Has it worked? No, he said. Alara looked at him, and he looked at her, and neither of them said the thing that was sitting there between them, because some things don't need to be said to be known. Some agreements are made the same way the chalk circle was made, without preamble, without ceremony, just a circle drawn on the pavement and space offered inside it. The scaffolding needs to be moved next Sunday, he said. We're starting the section above the parallel bars. What's going in that section? Sienna says the academy. Tessa wants the dragon. The friendly dragon, Alara said. The one that just looks scary, he confirmed. Alara looked through the glass again. They should be able to have both. That's what I told them. She nodded. And then, because she was a person who was still learning how to inhabit the present without organizing it into the future, she took a breath and let it out slowly, and looked at the October sky. The same October sky, 1 year later, holding its blue with the same thin commitment. And she didn't plan anything. She just stood there, in the cold, beside a man she hadn't planned on, watching 2 children she hadn't planned on sharing, in a life that had not gone the way any of her 47 business plans had imagined. It was better this way. Not easier. Not smoother. Not without the accumulated difficulty of 2 people who had been broken in different ways, learning how to be in the same place without either of them having to disappear. But better. Ronan knew, standing there, that he hadn't fixed anything. He hadn't saved anyone. He'd knelt beside a little girl in a park and asked her what she loved and drawn a circle on the pavement, and everything else had grown out of that, the way things grow when you stop trying to control the direction and just give them room. He'd had his own broken things going into that October Saturday. The year that wasn't a good year. The mission he still didn't talk about. The particular loneliness of being someone who had spent years operating in extremes and was now living in the quiet, trying to figure out if the quiet was enough. It turned out the quiet had been the thing he needed. And out of the quiet had come Tessa, and out of Tessa had come a chalk circle, and out of the chalk circle had come everything else. A ceiling half-painted with a kingdom that kept expanding, a center full of children who were learning that what they loved mattered, 2 girls who had chosen each other with the completeness that children bring to their commitments, and a woman standing beside him who had started the year believing that every problem had a solution you could fund and had ended it. Understanding that some of the most important things were free and unmeasurable and had been available all along. None of it was finished. The ceiling would take another year at minimum, and the center had a waiting list and a budget that needed to grow, and Ronan and Alara were still in the early stages of whatever they were building, and Sienna still had hard days, and Tessa still brought home improbable requests, and the refrigerator on Calverton Street was making a new sound that was different from last year's sound. But in the main room of the Chalk Circle Initiative, above the chalk tables and the supply shelves and the parallel bars and the spot on the floor where Sienna had walked across open space and held out her hand, the ceiling was spreading into something. A kingdom and a harbor and a bridge under tension and a lighthouse on a cliff and a cat named Marble with 3 kittens, painted by children who had been told in various ways that their reach was limited, proving instead what Sienna had understood from the first time she'd leaned forward with chalk in her hand, that you draw what you can imagine, and then you see what holds.